Hi guys, it's Wednesday and that means classic rock. And today we're looking at the band Blood, Sweat and Tears. Over the years they've had a number of personnel changes and surprisingly a lot of them have really worked. The first album was a different personnel and it came out and a lot of people don't recognize that as their first album. A lot of people look at Blood, Sweat and Tears 2 as what they consider the first album when David Clayton Thomas was the leader. But before that, there was another album came out. Al Kooper was doing vocals. It was called Child is the Father to the Man. And key player on there was, we also had Randy Brecker on trumpet, who by the second album was replaced by Lou Soloff. I have a number of albums that I wanted to just touch on because there's occasional hits. I'm looking at, firstly, let's take a look at Blood, Sweat and Tears 3. Big hit off the album, Heidi Ho, Lucretia McKeevill. But he's also got stuff on here. We got Sympathy for the Devil, Rolling Stones. We've got Fire and Rain by James Taylor. The albums were very similar like the album Chicago had. What you heard on the radio was not necessarily what you were going to hear on the album. They've got extended performances. We've got additional solos that didn't make the radio cut because we were trying to keep the song short those days. You know, that 2 to 3 minute song was what the radios were looking for. When you got the albums, you got a chance to hear a little more. You got extended versions, you got more solos, you got songs that weren't quite as commercially sellable. So that was one of the albums. I'll just give you an idea of the personnel we're looking at on here, because this was the personnel that stayed with them for quite a while. David Clayton Thomas would lead vocals. We had Fred Lipsis on sax, Lou Soloff and Chuck Winfield on trumpet, Jerry Hyman on trombone, Steve Katz. We had Dick Halligan doing a lot of different instruments from trombone to organ, piano. He also played kitchen sink, apparently. That's how many instruments he was playing. Jim Fielder and Bobby Columbia on drums. Another album that I enjoyed, and again, it was kind of a stretch on some of it, Blood, Sweat and Tears 4. And what's changed here is we've added trombone player Dave Bergeron. And to me, he was one of the great players they had. Don't Go Down Gamblin' was the big hit for this album. But we also had a lot of different songs. I see so many on here that really weren't commercial hits. The other one probably was Lisa, Listen to Me. The same basic horn section. Bergeron was playing trombone, tuba, bass trombone, and baritone horn. And he stayed with them for quite a while. But again, when I'm looking here, I've got John the Baptist, Holy John, by Al Kooper, Redemption, High on a Mountain by Steve Katz, Valentine's Day, a lot of songs written by members of the band starting to get their work into the albums. Now, after this album, David Clayton Thomas kind of branched off, went on his own to do some solo work, and they brought in a new vocalist. And sometimes that's going to be the end of a band. It really doesn't work. This one we kept a lot of the same players, but we now add Jerry Fisher as vocalist, and trying to see if I can find him there. You can see him right in the middle of the picture, just down in front of Lou Soloff. We've also added some other personnel in the back. We now have Larry Willis on electric piano, George Wozniak on guitar. And other than that, they stay pretty similar. Don't really know if we had a big hit off this album. One of my favorites off this album was Bob Dylan's Down in the Flood. They do an excellent arrangement of that. Over the Hill by Dave Bergeron. He does one of his own songs. It's also a performance or arrangement by Lou Marini Jr. on saxophone. We've added him to the band. And you'll maybe recognize Lou Marini's name because he showed up with the Blues Brothers on the albums we looked at before. And we'll find another Blues Brothers alumni showing up here shortly on one of their other albums. But that one is another great one, Blood, Sweat and Tears, called New Blood, where we've added new singer Jerry Fisher. Now, another album, and this is where we get into the other Blues Brothers, and of course we're talking New York, we're talking a guy that plays with everybody. Who else could it be but Tom Bones Malone in there? This is No Sweat by Blood, Sweat and Tears. Pretty much the same band. Larry Willis, Lou Soloff, George Wozniak, Bobby Columbia, Jerry Fisher, Dave Bergeron, Lou Marini, and we've added Tom Malone. Again, I'm looking at this and probably no real hits, but a great album. And that's kind of fun too, because a lot of times, it's like I mentioned with John Mayall, Delbert McClinton, Van Morrison. Sometimes when there's not a hit to kind of focus on, you can listen to that whole album and hear it with different ears, because you're not looking for that one big tune. And it's surprising what you might find on here. And this is true with a lot of albums, that we don't have one hit that, that album's hanging on. You kind of discover a whole new sound or a whole new appreciation of that album. And at this point, we're getting to the stage where bands were getting away from working around the hits. They wanted to show what they could do. They wanted to stretch out and do different material, so we really get to see another side of the bands. Now, when I first got to see Blood, Sweat, and Tears, it was probably the mid-'70s, and that time David Clayton Thomas had come back. And they were touring behind this album, New City. And again, some personnel changes. We've now changed the trumpet section. We've added Tony Clack on trumpet, who years ago had played with Woody Herman's band. He was one of their arrangers and trumpet players for them. Other than that, it's pretty similar. Ron McClure is now on bass. We still have a lot of the same players we had with the other. Bobby Colomby's still with them. He'd been one of the original players and still there. And we're on that same thing. Probably, if anything was a hit from here, it was Ride Captain Ride and the song Yesterday's Music. But again, not a lot of radio airplay. It was an album that you got to discover and find your own hits, find out what really appealed or connected with you. And just the last album I'm going to mention, and by this time, things were changing. It wasn't the same band it had been. An album called More Than Ever. Probably the two big hits on here was I Love You More Than Ever, and one of my favorites, You're the One. And this is one that we have an arrangement for with the big band that, well, I try and get out every now and then, see if we can play it, get a little David Clayton Thomas, a little BS&T out there to have our Canadian content. But it was probably one of the last big hits that I can think of them having. Over the course of the years, they had a long run. One of the first bands to start incorporating brass players and reed players into their rock music. They had the distinction of performing at Woodstock. David Clayton Thomas has been with them a couple of times, and it always sounds like home when he's there. It sounds like it's meant to be. Not that Jerry Fisher didn't do a great job. The albums he put out were very special as well, and a lot of good material to take a look at. So if you get a chance, check out Blood, Sweat, and Tears, one of the great bands from the 70s and decades beyond. That's it for today. Friday, we'll be looking at classical. Everybody stay safe, stay home. We'll see you then.